morning. My name is Lance. I'm the Director of Operations here at Faith. Excited to be with you today as we jump back into 2 Peter. We've worked our way through chapter 1. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And today we dive back into chapter 2. I had a friend in high school, not a close friend, but someone I had known really all our lives. And this was one of those guys that got away with everything. Have you ever known someone like that? He would sort of disobey his parents all the time, especially as we got into high school, and he seemed to never get caught doing it. He could fake this kind and sincere personality so that when the grown-ups are around, they'd say, "Oh, what a good kid, what a nice, polite young man," and then he'd just be the total opposite when they weren't looking. He would even cheat in school, and to my knowledge, never got in trouble for doing it. In fact, at the end of our senior year, all of the departments in our school gave away awards for whoever did the best in that particular subject. And this guy actually won an award in a subject at the end of our senior year, and he told me just after he won the award, the only reason he did well in that class is because he just copied answers off of the guy next to him. So if you've heard that phrase, what goes around comes around, for this guy, it just never came around. And for those of us watching this, it was kind of frustrating because think about it. I knew that it was wrong to disobey my parents. I knew I should be kind and polite and treat people the way they deserve to be treated. I knew I shouldn't cheat in school, but here's a guy that I'm close to that's doing all of those things and seeming to be rewarded for it. And I found that a little bit frustrating. I knew the right way, but the wrong way seemed to be much easier. You know, we use a few common words when it comes to living as Jesus followers you might be familiar with. We use words like endurance, trials, suffering, obedience. And I wouldn't blame you if at times you wonder, is all of that necessary? Because it seems like a whole lot of people are living the way they want, living to whatever benefits them the most right now, and they seem pretty happy doing it. There just don't seem to be any consequences. You know, you see athletes and celebrities in the news who abuse people or they cheat or they do things that we know are wrong, but if they're good at what they do, they just make more and more money doing it. You see that car in traffic that's running red lights and going way too fast, and that guy never seems to get pulled over. Meanwhile, when we go a little too fast, we get pulled over right away. Or maybe in your job, you try to do things the right way. You try to be a person of integrity, but you have that coworker or even a friend who seems to get the better position and the higher income by kind of faking it around the boss. And just in general, we have so much influence, so many people trying to lead us in different directions, saying, no, don't live that way, live this way. This is the best way to go. And we have to ask, are there consequences to any of this? It's not fun to talk about consequences. I don't like talking about consequences, but if you're trying to follow Jesus and live the way he lived, you might start to wonder, what's the point of all this? Why make every effort to follow Jesus when it's hard to see the reward? As our culture and even some in the church grow more and more opposed to living that way, why suffer and endure for Jesus when it seems like there's an easier way that might be more pleasant? Is life without consequences really how life works? So we're studying the book of 2 Peter under the title, Eyes Wide Open. Peter wrote this letter primarily to guard against corruption in the church. In chapter 1, he called his audience to keep their eyes wide open to Jesus. Because remember, this is what we've been saying, what captivates us dominates us, and it determines the outcome of our lives. Peter reminded us that his eyes were wide open to Jesus at that transfiguration event in Matthew 17. And he said that his eyewitness experience of that event confirmed the prophetic word about Christ's return. So the facts on which our faith is based can be fully trusted and lived by so that we can make the most of our lives. And as we begin chapter 2 today, Peter not only wanted us to keep our eyes wide open to Jesus, he also warned us to keep our eyes wide open to false teachers who would deny the very things that Peter had taught them. This is the whole focus of chapter 2 of 2 Peter. Because one of the main ways we end up living for things that are corrupt is when we're influenced by other people. So look with me at what he said in verse 1, chapter 2, verse 1. He said, "But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction." So verse 1 starts with a little reminder that builds on the end of chapter 1. Now, we're going to go back actually in a few weeks and look more in depth at chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. But for now, at the end of chapter 1, Peter reminded his readers that the prophetic word wasn't a myth created by man. It came directly from God speaking to men through the Holy Spirit. And if you study the Old Testament, you'll find that among those prophets, there were also false prophets who found their way into the mix, who would claim to be speaking for God, when in fact they were just making it up themselves for personal gain. Peter told his readers that just as these false prophets found their way into God's people, there would also be false teachers among them. So we're not talking about just outside influence. We're talking about outside influence, but it has worked its way into the community of believers. We're talking about unbelievers among those believers. We're talking about people who claim to be following Jesus and claim to be a part of the fellowship, but they taught something different than the message Peter wanted them to hold on to. So what would these false teachers do? Well, first, these false teachers would secretly bring in destructive heresies. So the word for heresy at this time, it simply identified a separate group or a different set of ideas. But in this case, Peter described the heresy as destructive, meaning it would be damaging in its spiritual effects on those who followed. The hardest part is that they would do it secretly, so they're not going to be obvious about it. It's like a spy or a double agent. You can't tell who they are. You really have to look for them. So what was this destructive heresy? What were they going to teach? Well, Peter said in this verse, they would deny the master who bought them. So the word translated master here in this verse, it's interesting because he uses the Greek word despot. Normally when they're referring to Jesus, they use kurios for Lord or master, but here he uses despot. That was a word typically used for the master of a house and his position over the servants in that house. And it actually says something about the authority of Jesus, the authority he has over these false teachers, whether they acknowledge him or not. So how do we know it's Jesus he's talking about? Well, we know it's Jesus because he says he's the master who bought them. So Jesus died on the cross for the sins of all, not just those who would believe. These false teachers, they weren't believers, but he died for them. 1 John 2:2 said he is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world. So he paid the price for the sins of everyone on earth, including these false teachers. That's why Peter refers to him as the master who bought them. But these false teachers would deny Jesus. So looking back to chapter 1, and if you look ahead to chapter 3, you can see that this denial specifically had to do with the promise of his return. They were starting to say it's all a myth. He's not really going to come back. Eyewitnesses who said he was going to return were starting to die, and they'd say, nothing's changing. So those false teachers, they capitalized on this, and they said there's not going to be a return, and therefore there's not going to be a future judgment. Now, you get a hint of the consequences that are hovering over them when he says he has this promise of swift destruction. But looking toward verse 2, along with bringing in this heresy, what else did Peter say would happen? That's where he goes next in verse 2. He said, many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. So the next thing he told them would happen is that many would follow their sensuality. Sensuality refers to a lack of self-constraint involving conduct that violates all bounds of what is socially acceptable. Typically, it referred to sexual sin. It's a word that puts pleasure as the highest pursuit. In the New Testament world, much like today, sexual license was the norm. That's why most of the New Testament writers had to deal with it in some way. They had to impress on new followers of Jesus that sex was something that God designed for one man and one woman in the context of marriage. Peter said these false teachers would come arguing that since there's no return of Christ and no future judgment, we're completely free to pursue pleasure in whatever way we want. So there's no foundation for your ethics. There's no reason to follow those steps to maturity from chapter 1, where we start with faith and add virtue, knowledge, self-control, endurance, godliness, and love. If he's not coming back, don't worry about that list, is what they would say. And it's tempting to fall into that way of thinking. It's easy to be captivated with the things of this world and live by its standards. That's why Peter warned them that many will follow it. And in following it, they would blaspheme or slander the way of truth. Early Christians weren't known as Christians at this time. They were known as those that followed the way because of how it dramatically changed the way they lived. But in following after sensuality, the sensuality of these false teachers, believers would be damaging that way of living that they were known for. In verse 3, he gave them one more warning of what these teachers would do, along with another character trait to identify them by. He said, verse 3, "And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words." So the word for exploit here was used to describe a common practice in this day where people would peddle opinions for material gain. They'd essentially sell their arguments and ideas, and they'd make a living doing this. And Peter told his readers this was going to happen, and that they would do it with false or deceptive words. Now, why would they do this? It's easy. Greed. Their motivation wasn't to help people or teach truth. It was to make money. Again, if there's no return of Christ, there's no reason to think beyond this life. So you should make as much as you can by any means necessary. That was their sales pitch. You ever been tricked by a really good sales pitch? I have, a few times. A few weeks ago in our house, we found something that no homeowner wants to find. We found evidence of a rodent living in our attic. Now, I immediately wanted to take care of this problem, but I definitely didn't want to do it myself. So I called the first company I could find that did pest control and told them the problem, and they said, "Okay, let me transfer you to our sales department." So I get on the phone with a sales guy, and this guy had a great pitch. I told him, "Here's my problem." And he started telling me all the ways they were going to take care of this problem. We're going to send one over. They're going to go in your attic. They're going to find these rodents. They're going to get rid of whatever's in your house. Then we're going to get outside your house. We're going to cover up any openings. We're going to take care of this problem. And I mean, I couldn't wait to give him my credit card information. I was just, please take my money and come get rid of this problem. So a couple days later, the guy who was going to do the actual work shows up, and he asked me a strange question when he gets out of his truck. He looks at me and he says, "What did they tell you I was going to do?" I said, "Well, they told me you were going to take care of our problem. You were going to get up in the attic and find these rodents and get rid of them. You're going to take care of the whole house, cover up any openings." And he looked at me just kind of sad, and he said, "I'm not going to do any of that." He said, "I'm going to put one trap out here, one trap over here, and that might solve your problem. We'll see." So I was kind of blown away. I said, "Well, why did they tell me you were going to do all these things? They said you were going to take all these steps to take care of the problem." And he just kind of looked at me and said, "Man, you were talking to the sales department. They'll say anything to get your money." You know, sometimes people are really good at deceiving us. And that's what was going on with these false teachers Peter warned them about. He warned that they would bring in a destructive way of thinking in denying the return of Jesus. Many would follow them, and that they would exploit these people in the church. And if you're wondering, why would so many people follow these false teachers? It's the same two reasons it always is. It's sex and money. You don't have to suffer or endure or have faith in some future event that's never going to happen, some myth a few people claim to be true. You should pursue all the pleasure and wealth you can now. This is all there is, so don't suffer needlessly. Follow my teaching for a small fee. So to someone trying to keep their eyes on Jesus, Peter is predicting some scary stuff. If you're a believer pursuing spiritual growth, trying to follow Jesus, and you see people around you doing things you know to be destructive and corrupt, you might start to wonder, does God see this? Am I suffering for nothing? Are there any consequences? So it's all bad news from Peter at this point in the passage. No good news. But he ends verse 3 with a really important statement. He said at the end of verse 3, their condemnation is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. In other words, God isn't taking a break right now. He said they've already been reserved for judgment. In Peter's day, one way you could sort of insult someone's belief in a God is to say he's inactive. He's not doing anything. Oh, he must be asleep. He must be taking a nap. Peter reminds them that's not the case with Jesus. And he confirms it in the next few verses by pointing them back to what God has done in the past. So you know, as we come to verse 4, verses 4 through 9 of 2 Peter is chapter 2. It's one long sentence in the Greek text that explains the end of verse 3. It's what you would call a conditional or an if-then statement. In this case, the if is assumed to be true, which provides a result or a then statement. If you've ever had to threaten consequences to a child, you do this all the time. Most behavior problems are repetitive, so you might point back to something that's happened in the past to promise what will happen in the future. So you'll say, if you didn't eat your dinner last time, and that caused you to not get dessert, then if you don't eat your dinner tonight, you won't get dessert. It's if then. It's how you show what has happened in the past to show what will happen in the future. And that's what Peter was doing in these verses. He was pointing to events in the past that his readers knew to be true and using that to confirm a promise of what would happen. And in this passage, he did that by pointing to two stories from the Old Testament, the story of Noah and the story of Lot. Here's what he said in verse 4. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. I'm going to stop right there. We all know the story of Noah, right? It's the story every child knows, even though it's also the story where God destroys the whole world. But the story starts in Genesis 6, where we're told that the sons of God were attracted to the daughters of man. So Jewish literature in Peter's day and many today argued that these sons of God were actually angels who rebelled against God here in Genesis 6. And they came down to earth, and in their lust, they impregnated the daughters of man. And the results of their action seem to be a world that falls deep into sin and rebellion. Immediately following this, in Genesis 6:5, God sees that the wickedness of man is great in the earth. It's so wicked, in fact, that he decides to destroy the earth with a flood. In the midst of all that wickedness, Noah found favor with God. Not that he was perfect, but he found favor. Genesis 6:9 refers to him as a righteous man. So you know the story. God calls Noah to build an ark, gather the animals, and prepare for a flood. And Peter called Noah a herald of righteousness. Think about what it must have been like for Noah before the flood. Based on the Genesis account, it was about 100 years from the time God told him what would happen to the time the flood actually happened. He lived in a corrupt culture that no doubt denied God and practiced all kinds of sensuality and greed. Imagine as he built the ark and he tried to explain what was coming, what God had told him, what he knew to be true, how they must have mocked him. Peter reminded his readers that God didn't spare those angels when they sinned. He didn't spare the world that had turned to wickedness, but he preserved Noah. Unrighteousness and righteousness came with consequences. The story of Lot, Peter referred to in verses 6 through 8, it's similar. He went on in verse 6, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. And if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. So like Noah, Lot found himself living in a community full of wickedness. He lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, and in Genesis 18, God decides that the sin in those places, they've gotten so wicked, it's so grave, that he would destroy both. But like Noah, there was something about Lot that God found favor in. Not that he was perfect, but God found favor in him. According to Peter, Lot was a righteous man who lived in the midst of corruption and wickedness. Peter said Lot was greatly distressed by their sensuality. There's that word again. And he was tormented day after day over their lawless deeds. So just like Noah, there was a time when Lot lived in the middle of a community turning against God, and he had to wonder, does God see this? Are there any consequences? And just like in Noah's time, God followed through with his punishment of the wicked, but he rescued Lot and he saved him from the destruction. The believers Peter wrote to should have been able to identify with Noah and Lot. They had put their hope in Jesus and the promise of his return. They were seeking to avoid corruption and pursue spiritual growth because they were captivated by Jesus. But they would see many around them following this message that denied Jesus and instead pursued sex and money. And they may have asked that same question, are there any consequences for this? But Peter reminded them that God rescued Noah, and he rescued Lot, and he judged the ungodly, and he punished them for their wickedness. And because those things are true, because we can look back at what God has done in the past for his people, Peter said in verse 9 that something else is also true. So if he did that in Noah's time, and he did that in Lot's time, verse 9, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. So if it's true that God destroyed the wicked and rescued the righteous back then, and Peter was assuming it was, he wanted his readers to draw two conclusions. First, that God knows how to rescue the godly from trials. In saying God knows how to rescue the godly, Peter wasn't just referring to his cognitive ability, but he was more making a declaration on his ability to rescue the godly. In other words, God is still fully capable of rescuing you from this. So as you follow Jesus and experience trials, seeking to escape corruption in light of his return, know that God is a God who rescues his people. He's always loyal to his people. He doesn't forget them. He sees them pursuing godliness no matter how bad the environment. Corruption finds its way into the church when we try to shortcut the trials. And that's why Peter drew one more conclusion. The second conclusion Peter drew for them was that not only does God know how to rescue the godly, he also knows how to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. You know, maybe these false teachers seem to be doing really well in life. Maybe there seem to be no consequences for denying Jesus and luring his people away in the pursuit of sex and money. Peter encouraged them that not only will God rescue you from these trials, but there will also be a day of judgment for the ungodly. And he points specifically to who this is in verse 10. He said, especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. He said this judgment is especially for them. This was a problem in Peter's day that we're seeing now. In some churches today, there's a movement to normalize what the Bible would call sexually sinful behavior, even at a leadership level. And it's a source of division in churches across the country. The issue is right there in verse 10. It's lust and despising authority. They said, there's no authority over me, so I get to live how I want. It's the opposite of the Christian message, but sometimes it seems like things are working out pretty well for them. Peter said, don't forget how God has dealt with the ungodly in the past. He's not sitting idly by or taking a nap or indifferent to what's going on here. He sees the corruption that happens, and he's fully capable of dealing with that himself. And with that in mind, the believer can keep their eyes wide open to Jesus and continue pursuing him, knowing that God will reward them in the end. In our men's Bible study that we do on Wednesday mornings a few weeks ago, we talked about a story from Greek mythology about a character named Jason and the Sirens. Now, if you've forgotten your Greek mythology like I had, the Sirens were these human-like creatures on an island in the sea, and they took the form of beautiful women, and they sang this beautiful song that would lure sailors in. And so it was said that as these sailors passed by this island, they would be lured in, and they would crash on the island and then be devoured by the Sirens. They thought nobody can get past this island. Well, there's a character named Jason who is the captain of a group of men called the Argonauts, and in their quest, they needed to sail past this island. So how did they get past it? Well, among his men, Jason had another character named Orpheus. Orpheus was a brilliant musician. And so when they passed by the island, Jason had Orpheus play his music. And as he played, Jason's men weren't drawn in by the song of the Sirens because they had something better to listen to. And that music was so beautiful and so loud in their ears that they never turned toward those sirens. They were captivated by something better. and it saved them from destruction. You pass by sirens every day in some form, hoping to lure you in to your own destruction. And Peter wanted us to be captivated by something better. He wanted us to be captivated by Jesus, especially the promise of his return. And when we're captivated by that, we won't turn toward those things that would lead us to destruction. As we've studied chapter 2 and 2 Peter, I keep going back to the lyrics of an old hymn that I've always loved. It says this, it says, "Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace." You might be sitting in here today, and as we've talked about being captivated by Jesus, you may say, I don't really feel that right now. I don't feel captivated by Jesus, and that's okay. I would encourage you to turn your eyes toward him this week. Maybe read one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Spend some time there. Focus on what he taught, who he was. Peter saw Jesus for who he really was, and he was never the same. He was forever changed by that. And you can be too. So turn your eyes toward him this week.